Thank you. As I mentioned, we welcome you to the Ronald and Leilani Walker Lecture, co-hosted by the History Department and the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. My name is Jay Buckley. I'll be doing a brief biography of Ron that the family helped compile so you can get to know him a little bit better. Over his 40-year career, Ron published over 100 articles and 8 books. His meticulous research and mastery of the historical narrative earned him numerous awards. Walker played an instrumental role in the new Western history movement. He courageously approached different subjects, never flinching from difficult subjects, never flinching from historical truth. Perhaps the best example of this is his book, Wayward Saints, where he wove the complicated story of an intellectual rebellion against the church in the 19th century. Ron's nuanced treatment of the themes of intellectual freedom, authority, orthodoxy, and personal spiritual convictions became what he called a parable for contemporary religious movements. It stands as one of the most important works in Mormon literature. Ron's encyclopedic knowledge of primary historical documents, mastery of content, and charitable treatment of subjects made him a valuable voice of Latter-day Saint history as it emerged as a rigorous academic discipline. He often waded into the most contentious topics with grace, charity, kindness, and confidence. The truth would prevail in the marketplace of ideas. Walker approached people with opposing viewpoints with a spirit of generosity, which forever broadened his circle of friends and admirers. Born in Missoula, Montana, Ron spent his younger years in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and his teenage years in Bakersfield, California. After a distinguished undergraduate collegiate experience, he planned to attend law school. Those plans were interrupted by spiritual promptings, which caused him to submit his papers to serve a Latter-day Saint mission. He was called to serve in the Southern States Mission from 1961 to 63. Upon returning, Ron studied history at Stanford. There, he met and married Leilani Midgley. While in California, he began teaching in the LDS Seminary and Institute programs. He acted as a director of the program in San Francisco. The Walkers then moved to Salt Lake City, where Ron pursued his doctorate at the University of Utah while teaching in the university's Institute program. Soon after, Leonard Arrington recruited him to join the burgeoning historical department. He quickly distinguished himself for his writing and meticulous research. In 1980, the church moved many historical department employees to the newly created Joseph Fielding Smith Institute at BYU. Ron was made a professor in that entity. He found mentoring and teaching students very rewarding. He loved the students at BYU and treated them as colleagues, often eschewing their impulse to call him Dr. Walker. Generations will remember Ron for his contributions to Mormon history, but family, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances will remember Ron for his great generosity, his faith, his church service, and his sense of humor. So we are going to have Brian Cannon talk a little bit more about the opening of the papers, and then my colleague Brendan Rensing at the Redd Center will introduce our speaker.
So in 2017 and 2018, friends and family of Ron Walker, including his widow, Leilani, and his children, established the Ronald W. and Leilani M. Walker Endowed Fund in Mormon and Western American history at BYU. This generous endowment generates thousands of dollars each year, which may be used to fund mentored student research, awards for student papers, and lectures on the history of Mormonism or the American West at BYU. I'm pleased to announce today the creation of a new student paper award in the history department, the Ronald and Leilani Walker Award in American West or Latter-day Saint history, to be awarded each spring at the History Student Awards Banquet, with a first place prize of $300 and a second place prize of $150. These papers will be judged by faculty who comprise our department Student Awards Committee. Ron's papers have recently been processed and open for research here at BYU. The papers, comprising over 100 linear feet of records, are housed in the L. Tom Perry Special Collections Library. They include note cards which contain his research on Brigham Young and Heber J. Grant, his personal journals kept from 1976 to 2016, and his research materials he collected over the years concerning topics such as Mormonism, the Utah War, and the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Ron taught Utah history courses here at BYU for many years. As long as endowment income permits, students in BYU Utah history courses, as well as students enrolled in the history senior seminars focused on Latter-day Saint or Western American history, who use the Walker papers as the major source for their research papers, will receive stipends of $200 upon successful completion of their research papers. We're grateful to the friends and family of Ron Walker for making this available to enrich education in Mormon and Western American history at BYU.
That clapping was for what he said, not for me coming down here. I'm very pleased to introduce our lecturer today. Dr. Matthew J. Groh is currently Managing Director of the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In that capacity, he leads a team of history professionals who collect documents and artifacts, preserve them, and promote understanding of the church's past through a publishing program, a research library, a museum, many historic sites, and there's new programs and divisions and things being created all the time to pursue these goals. Groh has also served in the past as general editor of the Joseph Smith Papers and the Saints, the story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints project. He received his PhD in American history from the University of Notre Dame, and before coming to the Church History Department was an assistant professor and director of the Center for Communal Studies at the University of Southern Indiana. He's the author, co-author, editor, co-editor of innumerable articles and a large number of books. A couple of sample titles: Liberty to the Downtrodden, Thomas L. Kane, Romantic Reformer, published by Yale University Press in 2009, and Parley P. Pratt, The Apostle Paul of Mormonism, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Along with a long list of titles, especially from the Joseph Smith Papers series and other works that grew out of that project. So join me in welcoming Dr. Groh.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. This is an imposing audience here today. It's really a deep honor, as well as a daunting task, to speak on Ron and Lonnie Walker as Ron's research collection becomes open to the public here at the university that he loved. The honor is deeper and the task more daunting to do so in front of some of those who knew Ron and Lonnie much longer than I did and loved them much deeply than I did. But today I'm hoping to do three things. First, I want to give a sense of who Ron and Lonnie Walker are. Second, I want to talk a little bit more about this fabulous research collection. And third, I want to talk about a book I'm working to finish with Ron, a biography of Brigham Young. It's one of those projects that I get the last word on, so that's good. So we've already heard a little bit about Ron's biography. He's born in Montana. As a toddler, he moves with his family to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His father was not a church member when Ron was born. He owned a drug and variety store. And as Ron recalled, he was devoted to his profession. Ron remembered his mother as an unusual, outspoken lady who loved clothes and might have been a clothing designer if she lived today. But in her time, he said, she became a homemaker, and a wonderful one at that. Ron had 3 brothers. Growing up in a small branch was pivotal for Ron. He remembered arriving at church early so that his mother could clean out the booze bottles of a club that our branch rented. He loved the community of the church. I remember working on Dad to get him to go to church, he said, trying to pull him out of bed. Eventually, when Ron was 12 or 13, his father studied the Book of Mormon after going through dozens of companionships of missionaries and became converted through his own study and prayer. Ron's experiences in the branch shaped his devotion to the church and his future studies. He thought that the sense of community, of caring for each other, seems to me to be the essence of the church. The branch progressed from the women's club to the Oddfellows Hall to the YMCA and so forth, and eventually Ron helped construct a little chapel. He said when it came time to purchase the piano for the building, there were no funds left. So Ron and his brother Dick gathered up their savings, nickels, dimes, and quarters, and a few bills stuffed in an old Quaker Oats box. It was a terrible sacrifice, he said, but helped make concrete this sense of unity, this sense of cooperation, this sense of shared purpose and sacrifice. Ron felt an almost innate connection to the past. And at BYU, he studied history, and literature. Those were my great loves. He found himself not in a small branch, but in a great community tied together by the gospel of Jesus Christ. He said, I loved BYU. I loved the values of the place. I loved the friends that I made there, the beauty of the campus, the mission of the university. After his time at BYU, he applied to law school. And he received a scholarship to the New York University School of Law. His church affiliation, he perceived, had benefited him. He went to San Francisco to interview for the competition with a panel of judges and lawyers, but they didn't ask him any questions. Rather, he said they started discussing among themselves about their experiences with Mormons. He said, I sat there and mainly listened. The scholarship promised to pay all my expenses and gave the assurance of a placement in a major New York City law firm. I was delighted. But God, Ron perceived, had other plans for his life. A series of spiritual experiences convinced him that he needed to decline the scholarship and go on a mission. At the time, I thought that I was making a great sacrifice, but I felt very much impelled. Indeed, he felt that the Lord had intervened in my life very dramatically. He had gained a strong sense of the church as community, as shared values. But he asked himself now, did the church mean anything more to me than a cultural heritage? The spiritual experiences made the answer clear. In his older years, Ron saw this as a critical juncture. Had he pursued the path of a Wall Street lawyer, my life would have been very different. As the years wore on, my feelings toward the church might have withered. That happened to several of my friends who took the high-octane career route. So Ron headed to the southern states. He said, I experienced the reality of the Spirit working in my life. It was a stirring, rich, wonderful experience. It was also a great cultural experience, as he experienced both the beginnings of the modern South and the existence of a raw, rural culture, a throwback to frontier America, where he experienced prejudice against his faith, but also came to respect and love these people. Returning home, he felt that he wanted to teach, to be a part of the molding of the future generation. So he pursued graduate degrees at BYU and then at Stanford. At a Stanford singles board, he met Nalani Ingeborg Midgley, then a high school teacher. Lonnie was Ron's intellectual, cultural, and spiritual equal and partner. She had studied ballet, loved horseback riding, read voraciously, had bachelor's and master's degrees in biology from Stanford and the University of London. They married and returned to Utah together so that Ron could pursue a PhD at the University of Utah. But first, in what he described as a mid-period sputtering, he worked for a few years for Pacific Telephone in San Francisco. At the University of Utah, Ron immersed himself in Latter-day Saint history. For a PhD dissertation, he began researching the Godbeites, Latter-day Saint merchants and intellectuals who in the late 1860s and 1870s challenged Brigham Young's leadership, asserting that he had gone too far in controlling the economic, intellectual, and spiritual life of pioneer Utah. The leading Godbeites found reassurance for their path in the spiritualism and seances popular in their time. Research on the Godbeites instilled in Ron a suspicion of accepted narratives and a respect for primary sources. And his research taught Ron how to look at what he called big themes. In this case, the contest between ideals and how we as individuals fall short. Ron's research caught the attention of Davis Bittney, a University of Utah professor who was also the assistant church historian, who introduced him to Leonard Arrington, the church's historian. Ronald, why don't you come down and take a summer fellowship with us at the historical department? While at the University of Utah, Ron had already become employed with the church educational system, teaching at the Institute of Religion, and then writing curriculum. Recognizing his talents, Leonard Arrington recruited him for his history division of researching and writing historians. Not wanting the CES secretary to know that he was recruiting Ron, Leonard would, when he called the office, would say, can you tell Ron Walker that Grover Cleveland is on the phone for him? And apparently she was not a great historian herself. So Ron's torn between a future teaching in CES and a future in history. And the church educational system generously told him if it doesn't work out in history, they'd have a spot for him. So he accepted the position. He said, when I joined the history division, it was riding at high tide. The times were exciting and heady. He loved the social and intellectual camaraderie of the other historians that Leonard had gathered. A few years later, as discontent among some at church headquarters against the history division became manifest, Ron remembered that he and the other young historians worried, even as Leonard tried to reassure them. Some church leaders had become concerned that the history being written by Leonard and his team was too secular, not faithful enough. These conversations brought soul-searching and even restless nights for Ron. After much thought and seeking, he concluded that he and his colleagues were facing a false dichotomy, posing the spirit against the intellect. The fusion of the two is what I have hoped to achieve in my writing. And Ron believed strongly history could not be a game of shading. Truth was truth, and the church would be made the better for it. I neglected to show a few more slides about Ron and Lonnie leaving for their honeymoon. So along with others in the history division, Ron was transferred to BYU in 1980 as part of the new Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Latter-day Saint History. And what an honor it is to have many of those who worked at the Smith Institute here today. He remembered an extraordinary camaraderie with Smith Institute colleagues. We cared about each other, and there were deep friendships. He said, rather than the intense competition you often find in the academy, here was unity. And he also said, I enjoyed being at the university again and working with students. Of course, tensions about faith and history, about the soul and the intellect, followed him to BYU. And he thought deeply about those matters. And he spent the rest of his career here at BYU, becoming known as a meticulous researcher, an engaging writer, a deep thinker, also renowned for his kindness, openness, candor, and generosity. Of course, Ron was much more than a scholar. He was a devoted father to 7 children, who he and Lonnie raised to be thoughtful and independent. Lonnie would say that their home was a laboratory, not a museum, because she was raising scientists and builders, not curators. Ron and Lonnie shared a deep faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they both served widely in the church and community. As Ron in his bishop's chair, when he served as bishops, he helped lead the efforts to construct a chapel in Salt Lake City. Lonnie loved church history as well, and served for years as a docent in the Church History Museum. Ron also served a 9-year term on the Salt Lake School Board. He helped create Ensign Peak Park. He loved the outdoors, finding sustenance for body and soul. I've been told this is a hike on Antelope Island, where, of course, Lonnie is in a skirt, and they have an infant, and lots of toddlers and little kids. That sounds hard. To the horror of his teenage children, on a trip to Banff, he bought a moose hat, which he wore throughout the trip, and sometimes even when they returned and went out to eat at local restaurants. I'm told that he choreographed his own dance, known still to the Walker children, to celebrate the winter solstice. They say they will give a rendition of this dance after the lecture. So working with Ron was my first break into the field of Latter-day Saint history. Many others can say the same. In 1999, when I was an undergraduate at BYU, I was hired as a research assistant at the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute. My first assignment, well, after Ron Esplin hired me, he said, "Why don't you go see if you can help Ron Walker?" And I remember meeting with Ron in his office in the basement of the Knight Mangum building. Ron's mind was always churning, thinking about how to finish existing projects, but also dreaming up new possibilities. He was always juggling several articles and books. He was a generous mentor. I felt he had an interest in my research for him, but also in me and my development. In my estimation, Ron was the best stylist, the best writer in Latter-day Saint history over the past generation. He wrote beautiful prose. He knew how to set the stage, how to draw the reader in, how to tell an engaging story, how to delve into personalities, how to point to broader significance. Art, he insisted, was part of the historian's craft. I believe that history should not just be about looking at the past, it should be literature. It should have an occasional good turn of phrase. It should have design, scene, plot, and narrative. Ron had a deep understanding of and appreciation for the humanity of his subjects, leaders and commoners, dissidents and the faithful. He thought many historians took on small academic subjects, topics that ignored big questions. To younger historians, Ron advised, do important things. Too many of us are satisfied with small and narrow topics. Find grand themes and grand topics. These are found in literature and certainly in scripture. But without searching for them and pondering them, they will not be found and used. So his Wayward Saints on the Godbeites is a classic. It's been mentioned already. One of the most elegantly written books on Latter-day Saint history. The grand theme involved the individual and authority, the balance between individual freedom and the good of the community. Massacre at Mountain Meadows is another classic. Written with Rick Turley and Glenn Leonard. It takes on our culture's darkest moment with candor, nuance, and depth. The grand theme here was how people who throughout their lives had served God, their families, their communities, could engage in a terrible atrocity. Massacre demonstrates another grand theme of Ron's career. Only the truth was good enough for the church he loved. These two books will be required reading in the field for decades. Ron's work on Latter-day Saint historiography and bibliography demonstrates how he cared about the field. His concern for the field is also evidenced by how collaborative he was. Most of his books and many of his articles were written with others. The field of Latter-day Saint history is unusually collaborative, and that, I think, is at least partly because of the example of Ron and others. Several years ago, Ron and I wrote a documentary history of the letters between Brigham Young and Thomas Paine. In our view, one of the most important sets of correspondence in our history. Ron had tremendous insight and voluminous research on Brigham Young. I had my own files on Thomas Paine. He was diagnosed with cancer not long after we began the project. Cancer slowed him down, but never drowned out his desire to write history or his ability to deliver a keen insight or turn a beautiful phrase. When he passed a draft to me, Ron inevitably apologized. "It's just a quick and dirty draft," he would say. "Maybe you can make something of it." If only my drafts could sing like Ron's. I continued to learn from Ron's prose, from his demanding analysis of primary sources, from his search for context. But we're here today partly to celebrate the opening of the Ronald W. Walker papers at Special Collections. We've already heard a little bit about it. Let me just give you a little bit more sense. The first thing to know is that the collection is large. Ron kept stuff. After he retired, his friend Harris Simmons gave Ron office space in the Zions Bank building downtown. After he retired, then Ron could be found among his filing cabinets, his papers, his books. Ron's research collection consists of 141 normal archival boxes, 57 media archival boxes, as well as odds and ends. That's more than 100 linear feet of material. So just think about what 100 linear feet of stuff looks like in archival boxes. It's a massive commitment for an archive to organize and make available to the public such a large collection. So thanks to John Murphy, who led the process, and Nate Burrows, a manuscript processing specialist. The first large category in the collection is Ron's note cards that contain his research on Brigham Young, Heber J. Grant, other material. These note cards summarize and provide insights into the collections on Brigham and Heber at the Church History Library. A second large category is other research materials on Brigham Young, the Utah War, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Heber J. Grant, Ensign Peak, Native Americans, and many other topics. For any scholar researching on these themes, spending substantial time in these files would be a huge shortcut. A third category is Ron's correspondence and his personal journals from 1976 to 2015. So today, after long procrastination, I begin my journal in 1976. Some ground rules are in order. And he goes ahead and he's very systematic in how he approaches things. So he establishes the ground rules and then gets into it. I'm sure there's a lot of people in these rooms that are in those journals, so we might just want to head down to Special Collections next and find some tidbits. There are also extensive electronic records. When I first began working with Ron, I was suspicious of his technological capacity because he told me I had to buy WordPerfect. And while I never came to appreciate Ron's entrenched attitudes about WordPerfect, I came to understand that he had used technology in clever ways throughout his career. Of particular interest among the electronic files are many word cruncher databases. Word cruncher is a tool created at BYU for organizing data in ways that can be searched in various ways. For instance, Ron has a word cruncher database on travel narratives about the Latter-day Saints in the 1800s, where dozens and dozens, my guess is between 100 and 200 of these travel narratives, some very short, some a little bit longer, were transcribed and then put in, Ron says 300?
A little more than 300.
Okay, a little bit more than 300. And if you don't have a word cruncher database, we put some good technology people on it, we cracked the code, we created searchable PDFs from them if you don't want all the capacity of the word cruncher. So now let's talk about Brigham for maybe the last 15 or 20 minutes of our lecture. In his final years, Ron's main task was writing a biography of Brigham. Ron had sketched out an outline of a biography. He would write new chapters from the 18-teens to the 1850s and then turn to a more thematic approach, integrating many articles he'd written over the years. Brigham in the arts, Brigham as a preacher, Brigham in the word of wisdom. As he delved into the biography, Ron always saw possibilities for other projects. Wouldn't a book, or better yet, a film on the Latter-day Saints and California-bound 49ers capture the clashes and the cooperations of that era? Wouldn't a history of the Utah War restore that clash to its place in American history? Wouldn't a collection of Brigham's letters with Native Americans reveal much? And wouldn't several articles on the territorial clashes of the 1850s add to our understanding? It was clear to see the larger pattern, and I felt guilty for my part in distracting Ron with the Thomas Cain Brigham Young letters. I worried that Ron wouldn't be able to finish the biography. In the months before he died, Ron asked several times if I would finish. I dodged, telling Ron he still had time, that he didn't know what the future held, but he knew. And after his death, his children, John and Jen, asked again their father's question, and this time I said yes. So for the past several years, I've been working on this biography of Brigham Young, doing new writing as well as integrating Ron's partial drafts and past articles. I'm trying to retain his vision and his voice while also making changes. Rather than shift to a topical approach for the last 20 years of Brigham's life, I want to remain more chronological, letting the story unfold. I kind of think Ron would have come to that conclusion as well. And if not, well, when you're working with an author on the other side, it turns out you do have the last word. Historical individuals are tough to understand. We only know them through the scraps they leave behind or through what other people said about them. We can't talk it with them ourselves. We can't get a feel for their mannerisms. We can't judge whether, through personal interaction, they come across as sincere or selfish, haughty or kind. I've written biographies in the past of Thomas Cain and Parley Pratt. And after I wrote them, I thought, do I really know them? I'm not sure that I really captured who they were. And perhaps when I get to the other side, I'll be able to judge for myself, and they'll probably tell me what I got right and what I got wrong. But Brigham is tough to understand not because he left behind only scraps. He left behind volumes, thousands and thousands of letters, hundreds of pages of journals, hundreds of sermons, almost 1,000. And thousands of people left observations of Brigham. He was larger than life. He was a celebrity. So what is fact? What is fiction? What is surface? What is core? And he wasn't on the public stage for just a few years. He led the church for over 3 decades. Even before that, he was a public figure. Writing a biography is also difficult because of his family relationships. When I wrote about Thomas Cain, I tried to understand the relationship between he and his wife Elizabeth. It's tough to get the feeling of a marriage only through what's left behind. When I wrote about Parley Pratt, I tried to understand the relationship between he and the 12 women he married. Well, that was tougher. But Brigham was still the dozens of women, 16 of whom lived in his households. The problem is compounded because our culture is so different from his. Perceptions of Brigham today often rest on our own beliefs on topics like gender and race and authority. People today ask if Brigham was sexist or racist or authoritarian or violent. And certainly by our standards, he falls short. Certainly by our standards, he said things that make us cringe. Sometimes I have thought, why did you say that, Brigham? Or did you have to say it like that? But he also said things that are profoundly progressive for his era, of his support for women's education and voting, of his advocacy for peace with American Indians and appreciation for their humanity, of his deliberately leading the saints across the plains rather than risk more violence. He would rather be wronged than do wrong, he told the saints on many, many occasions. So he's a complex figure. But this university that bears his name, I don't think we need to be ashamed of Brigham Young. Another important thing to remember is that, like all of us, Brigham grew and matured throughout his life. Several years ago, I worked on a documentary history of the first 50 years of Relief Society, tutored by Carol Madsen and Jill Durr. We included a document that quoted Brigham explaining why the Relief Society would not be reorganized following the death of Emma Smith. Following the death of Joseph Smith. Brigham had a falling out with Emma, then president of the Relief Society. He said hard things about her. And the Relief Society and the role of women. But I learned we can't leave Brigham in 1845 in the shadow of Joseph's death as he wondered how he could protect the saints and their religion. We have to follow him to Utah. We have to let him progress and mature. In 1868, he asked Eliza Snow to reorganize the Relief Society and became a major advocate for the role of women in the church and in society, for voting rights, for education. So if we only look at Brigham in 1845, we miss the growth. I want to end the lecture today by suggesting a few keys to understanding Brigham. To give a sense of Brigham's life and the complexity of his interests and his thinking, I'd like to quote from an introduction written by Ron. Ron wrote, "What was there about this man that caused such polar emotion? President Brigham Young stirred the emotions of both saint and sinner, friend and foe. Brigham confused, embittered, dominated, engaged, convulsed, but also shaped, built, and made. The Latter-day Saint seen from the time he assumed his leadership in 1844 to the moment he exited 33 years later. Some described his aspect as that of a minor alderman or prosperous New England farmer, plainly dressed, seemingly unhurried. About 5'8" tall, about average for the time, he had a strong physique. One knew when he or she were in Brigham's presence. By his own admission, when called to the Quorum of the 12, some murmured. They thought him a disgrace to the house of Israel, who needed a figurative stool to reach high enough to tie the shoe of some of the more accomplished apostles. Sometimes there was pettiness to the complaints. Brigham himself understood his lack of sheen. When first assuming church leadership, at times he was inwardly uncertain, which he masked with a certain blunder. I used to think, until I was 45 years old, that I had not knowledge, sense, or ability enough to enable me to associate with the men of the world, he said. What a change later life made. He became quite simply the ablest Latter-day Saint of his generation. If judged by breadth of interest, creativity, force of will, shrewdness, or that knack which some men and women have to impel and make things happen, our church has never seen his equal. His office journal chronicles some of his interests. He had one of the territory's first sewing machines brought to his office for personal scrutiny. He showed an amateur's interest in the microscope and telescope. Books on smelting and iron making were read to him. And the next day, several scripts for a proposed dramatic production. He briefly studied phonography. Today, we would say stenography. And for many years, doggedly sought a revolution in the English language. A chemist gave him a private lecture on the poisonous property contained in salt poison. Or Brigham and his circles of advisors might discuss naval armaments, Nevada statehood, the politics of Washington, the making of molasses, and producing turpentine. When time permitted, he walked a half block from his office to ensure sobriety at the social hall, or another few paces south to regulate the Salt Lake Theater. One prominent actress thought him better informed on stage management than many Eastern professionals. So I hope that gives a sense of Ron's thoughts on Brigham. Why write a new biography? The two most important past biographies are Leonard Arrington's American Moses, published in the 1980s, and John Turner's Pioneer Prophet in 2014. Both are deeply researched and illuminate Brigham's religious, social, and political worlds. I feel a connection to both authors. Leonard Arrington wrote his biography when he was in a similar position to the one I held for several years in the church history department. John Turner was a classmate of mine at the University of Notre Dame. Arrington tends to emphasize politics and economics. Turner does more to situate Brigham within the religious world of his day. But readers generally emerge with a darker version of Brigham than is my own take and Ron's. So a few reasons for a new biography. One is simply that each generation comes at subjects of enduring interest with new questions. Another is that Ron aimed, and I'm still aiming, to write a literary biography, one with a well-crafted and page-turning narrative. Another reason is that we just have more information on Brigham now. We've been able to unlock many of his sermons that were only recorded in shorthand. There's newly released records. A few years back, we received hundreds of letters in one of Brigham's office journals as a donation in the church history library. Another reason is that the biographies of Arrington and Turner kind of run out of steam by the time they get to the particularly Turner's late 1860s and 1870s. But that final 15 years of Brigham's life is really interesting. And it's a story, I think, that hasn't been told as well as we need it to. Finally, one researcher commented to me that after reading a biography of Brigham, she wasn't sure why anyone would have followed him across the street. But the saints followed him across the country. If we don't understand Brigham's heart, we'll fail to understand the history of the church. So I'm just going to tell you 3 things that I think are kind of keys to understanding Brigham. Number 1, the people loved Brigham because he was one of them. Take, for instance, this quote from the Teachers' Corps Minutes of a Salt Lake Ward. In those days, teachers were grown men, not 14-year-old boys. John Lyon Sr. said, "It only required a person to be acquainted with the president to love him. He did not believe there was a man on earth that could hate Brigham." Brigham's detractors then and now have portrayed him as thoroughly unlikable. But it wasn't true. We have to understand what Brigham was trying to accomplish. In his 30s, he'd been called on a mission to England, where he'd seen the excesses of the Industrial Revolution, of how a few people accumulated great riches and the many suffered for it. Those were the conditions that gave rise to Karl Marx. Brigham found his solution in religion, which he believed would inspire cooperation that would insulate his people from both the excesses of poverty and of wealth. He thought both could be destructive. He believed in education, in the dignity of work, and the ability of cooperation to build unity and design society. So there's this common perception of Brigham as an authoritarian, harsh leader. And he could be at times. But those who knew him well, the Latter-day Saints, loved and followed him. They went where he asked, across all the far-flung valleys and mountaintops of the American West, and on missions of the world. They went because they believed in the gospel of Jesus Christ, but they also followed Brigham because they believed he had their best interest in mind. They didn't call him President Young. They called him Brother Brigham. So key number 2. To understand Brigham, you have to understand the family connections that shaped his life and his approach to the gospel. We're hoping these family connections will be on the stage in the biography. Now, you won't be surprised when I tell you that Brigham had a big family. That's always been at the center of public perceptions of Brigham. But I mean something a little bit more expansive. Brigham's family was large in about every sense possible. Siblings, cousins, nieces and nephews, wives, children. And the family connections matter. So Brigham was one of 11 children. All joined the church. Most come to Utah. Among those, among the Youngs, those 11 siblings, they have 176 children. So think about what that means. Kirtland is full of Youngs. Nauvoo is full of Youngs. Salt Lake is full of Youngs. All these nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters-in-law, they're all throughout his life. And if you see those connections and learn those connections, you start to see them everywhere. Of course, then, we have Brigham's own family. This is how Brigham Young lived. He had a mansion in Nauvoo. No, this is a painting in Nauvoo by a painter named William Major. And the sort of the painting code of the day was, you painted your subjects in sort of classical scenes. Nothing in Nauvoo has ever looked like that. So Brigham initially marries a woman named Miriam Work. She dies shortly after they joined the church. 2 of her siblings joined the church. And even at the end of his life, as he performs work for the dead, he goes back and performs ordinance work for Miriam's family. He then marries Marian Angel, who's a member of the church. All of her siblings who live to be adults are also members of the church. And so you begin to think about brothers and sisters-in-law, and her cousins joined the church, and you begin to see them everywhere as well. After the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, Joseph Smith told Brigham Young to go and convert more of his family. All the siblings are already in the church. Brigham had 150 cousins. And he goes to many of them. Eventually has success with 2 big branches of the family. One is the Richards family. Rhoda Howe Richards is his aunt. Eventually she, her husband, most of their children and grandchildren joined the church. Nauvoo is full of Richardses. Salt Lake City is full of Richardses. In 1850, there's a Richards in the first presidency and another in the Quorum of the 12. They're everywhere, these connections. Brigham's family connections continue to expand and at an accelerating pace with the beginning of plural marriage. As I've studied Brigham's plural wives, I've been struck by how many of them connected him with other families throughout the church. So again, lots of networks. And of course, then there's his own 57 children who form really critical relationships in his life. So that's number 2, the family. Number 3, many people describe Brigham Young as a practical leader, by which they mean he was not much of a spiritual leader. And Brigham did have a gift for practical leadership, for organizing, for colonizing. But he was also profoundly spiritual. This is a man, when he first meets Joseph Smith, who begins speaking in tongues. Nothing illustrates Brigham as a spiritual leader better than his relationship with the temple. He worked on the Kirtland Temple and was present when the great spiritual manifestations happened. In 1842, when the saints are ready to dedicate the baptistry in the Nauvoo Temple, Joseph asked Brigham to do that. He works tirelessly on the Nauvoo Temple. It's one of the first to receive the endowment ordinance. It's soon sealed to his wife, Mary Ann. After the death of Joseph Smith, Brigham is confronted with the dilemma. It's apparent that the saints would soon have to leave Nauvoo. The threat of violence is rising. Their enemies are too numerous and too powerful, and the temple isn't close to completion. Should they risk violence and complete the temple, knowing that all their work would be poured into a building they would abandon? Brigham takes the question to God. He wrote in his journal, "I inquired of the Lord whether we should stay here and finish the temple. The answer was, we should." From that moment, Brigham displayed no doubt. They would leave Nauvoo, but not until the temple was finished. After the saints arrived in Salt Lake, Brigham dedicated the temple site in 1853, personally supervised its construction. When it was apparent it wouldn't be finished in his lifetime, he directed that a temple be built in St. George so that the saints could perform ordinance work for the dead that had not yet been performed, the endowment for the dead and other ordinance work. Baptism for the dead were happening at that time, but not the others. So in fall 1876, Brigham traveled south to St. George to dedicate the temple. And this is Brigham in about 1876. He got crankier as he got older, a little bit. He must have sensed that he was near death. He had significant health problems. Rheumatism and arthritis in his feet made walking difficult. On the day of the dedication, 1,500 saints squeezed into the temple, actually 1,200. They squeezed into the temple. They first dedicated the baptistry in the basement. Brigham's chair had been fitted with rollers so that he could be moved within the temple, and 4 strong men carried that chair with Brigham in it down to the baptistry. From the baptistry, they went to the main floor where another dedication took place. Then a smaller group with Brigham again hoisted in his chair went upstairs to dedicate the sealing rooms. For the first time in 3 decades, the saints had to dedicate a temple. And it would be a temple unlike the ones in Kirtland and Nauvoo, for here they would perform all the ordinances for the dead. The end of the dedication, Brigham, leaning on his cane, went to the pulpit. He lifted the eyes of the saints toward eternity. When I think upon the subject of the work for the dead, I want the tongue of 7 thunders to wake up the people. Can the fathers be saved without us? No. Can we be saved without them? No. Supposing we are awake to this thing, namely the salvation of the human family, this house would be crowded, as we hope it will be, from Monday morning until Saturday night. He concluded, I do not know whether the people are satisfied or not. I am not half satisfied, and I never expect to be satisfied till the devil is whipped and driven from the face of the earth. He struck the pulpit with his cane so forcefully that it left dents in the wood. He then remained in St. George for several months, personally overseeing the work and engaging in personal family history and temple work for the people he loved. So I hope that gives those 3 thoughts give a little bit of a sense of Brigham. The sense that he led because the people felt like he was one of them. The importance of these family connections and the importance of the spiritual aspects of Brigham, particularly the temple. So let's conclude where we began. A thought on Ron to conclude. Here in mortality, on this side of the veil, we historians see, as the New Testament says, through a glass, darkly. We know the past only through what remains, the fragments of a life captured in documents and artifacts. Even in well-documented lives, there are silences and gaps and contradictions and lingering questions. I imagine that when historians cross the veil, they're greeted not only by their kin, but also by the people they studied. I can imagine Heber quibbling with Ron over this detail or that. When pressed by Brother Brigham, I can see Ron readily acknowledging that he may have misunderstood something about this aspect of the personality. But mostly, I think there must be gratitude on that side of the veil for a historian like Ron who took their lives seriously. And by there, I mean not just Brigham and Heber, but the hundreds of Latter-day Saints who filled his articles and his books and his note cards and his files. He heard their voices. He spoke their names. He allowed others to remember and learn from their lives. We know little about how life will be constructed there. But I can't imagine that Ron can exist with his curiosity and his good humor and his love of people without a history project or 2 or 3 or a half dozen, researching, learning, writing. Maybe he'll even leave an unfinished project or 2 of celestial history for some of us to collaborate with. Thank you so much.
Can we take some questions?
I can take, yeah, sure.
We have a few minutes to take some questions.
Looks
so
like we got 6 minutes, but people can leave too.
if you need to leave for class or
Please.
lunch, you're welcome to. Will you just repeat the?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question for. Please.
How do you keep track of all the data you collect and then find it to put it into a narrative?
Well,
You don't have the word cruncher
I
anymore.
don't, I just have never really been able to be persuaded by the virtues of word cruncher. I know that some are more persuaded than I am. I try to work on a portion at a time, right, to kind of immerse myself. So like 6 months ago, I was working on this chapter in 1871, 1872, and just tried to, I tried to immerse myself in the sources and the notes of that time, and then try to write it. This is a really interesting time in Brigham's life. He's under house arrest, and really the full weight of the federal government is being brought down on Brigham. The IRS is involved. The federal troops are involved. Congress is involved. The judiciary is involved. And you just see all this really interesting coordinated effort to kind of break his power in Utah. But that's how I do it. I try to just take a manageable piece and immerse myself and get it written before I forget it all. Please, Jesse.
So, how do you deal with something like Brigham Young? Because there left very few actual records. The diaries of grief.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So in one way, in one sense, we have a ton of records on Brigham Young. Oh, so the question was, how do you deal with someone like Brigham Young who actually doesn't leave a lot of personal records? So of course and the personal records that we do have are mostly from the 1830s and 1840s, and Ron knows this especially.
We just published the book of
Yeah.
all of the personal journals that he wrote in his own hand.
Yeah, so Ron is just saying the Brigham Young Center just published a book with all the journals kept in Brigham's hand, right? And it's a small fraction of the total journals. And the letters written in his own hand are a very small fraction of the total letters. And a lot of them from the 1830s, right, when he's on his missionary journals and he's writing to Mary Ann or the
He and
family.
Jesse gathered 95 letters in his own hand
Okay.
out of 10,000.
So 95 out of 10,000 letters in Brigham's own hand, right? So you are dealing with the mediation of clerks and scribes and other people writing about Brigham. I mean, the interesting thing about Brigham is once he comes to Salt Lake, except for his trips to St. George, he basically never leaves. And it's when people leave that you get letters. Right? It's when they're not writing a letter to to their wives when they're to his wives when he's in Salt Lake. And so because he's always at church headquarters it is more of a challenge. And so, you just try to understand what the mediation of the sources are. And certainly, the sermons, I think, are a way to get at Brigham. He leaves a lot of sermons, and some of them are kind of tidied up before they're in the Journal of Discourses, but we do have the shorthand. And Brigham, I think Brigham is pretty candid, pretty true to who he is in the sermons. I mean, it's hard to give a 2-hour sermon and not, especially, in Brigham's sermons, it wasn't like he covered one topic, right? Whatever was on his mind. And so by following the sermons, you can get a pretty good sense of Brigham in the later years, what's on his mind, what his thoughts are. Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Go ahead, John.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about where the state of LDS history is today. In terms of, certainly my father was influential in some of that period, but it'd be great to know where you think it's going, where we are today. And
yeah, well, we could probably have a 2-hour conversation about that, and I'd want Grant and Ron and Carol and Jesse and Jill to weigh in as well. I think the field is really vibrant. I think we're in a really good place. I think, there's there's aspects of the field that are getting increasing attention, in terms of like the history of the global church or the history of women in the church. So you can see some of those areas getting a lot more attention. I do think that, Ron has this interesting career, right, where he's at, he's downtown at church headquarters, and then he's at BYU. And for 30 years after the Smith Institute moved to BYU, there wasn't much history that, in terms of research and writing, that took place at church headquarters. And so, I think Ron's leadership with bringing the Joseph Smith papers back and reinvigorating that scene at church headquarters has been really important as well. So, a few thoughts. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Jen?
So I think my dad agreed with you that Brigham was persistently misunderstood, right? And I'm just curious about why you think that is. When is it that a big theme question? Why do you think people persistently want and consistently want to misunderstand him or paint him in a certain way? Is it they want it to conform to their narrative? Is it that he was so complex, it's just easier to pick up one piece and not all of it? I'm just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think he was easy to caricature in the 19th century, and he has been easy ever since, right? So, polygamy just made it easy to caricature who he was and reduce it to like very simple narratives. And I think he was just such a symbol of things that so many Americans at the time were uncomfortable with, both in terms of polygamy, but also in terms of combination of church and state and all those kind of democratic type issues. He becomes, a symbol for what's wrong. And then I do think a lot of it's about conforming to, our own narratives that people bring to the past, right? So I think if you were to do a study of like Brigham on Twitter or Brigham on Facebook in the last 10 or 15 years, right? You would come to the conclusion that Brigham was a very violent, racist person, right? And certainly on the charges of violence, I just think that's nowhere near the case. I think Brigham consistently pulls back from violence throughout his life. And consistently is a force for peace. Now, on race, it's a more complicated question. Brigham is very much a white American in the 1800s, right? And so on those sort of questions, we never. I think we always want to understand the past on its own terms, but that doesn't mean that we need to suspend judgment. And say, certainly they were falling short of values that they could have found in the scriptures or things like that, right? So I think we can also, try to understand the culture of the day and also lament and mourn a little bit about how long it took us as a culture to get to certain places. Yeah. Please.
Matt, are you going to follow up at all on Ron's work on Heber J. Grant?
No.
In a word.
No, I'm not. I think there's others that would take on that work, and we can talk afterwards. But yeah, so not me personally, but I think it will be picked up. Any other questions? Should we call it and go to lunch and do what else we're doing? Thanks.